Welcome back, everyone. This is the third video I've made, and this one is a description of the first reflection paper that you were to write. So I'm going to be using this format for many of the other videos where you can hear my voice over a PowerPoint, and then I can also draw on the PowerPoint. Oops, I thought like this. That was not intended to be a sinister face. So this first assignment, this is going to be due on the 26th. Although, again, there's an asterisk next to that because, as I've said, sorry, a little bit very new to this. The due date of the 26th has an asterisk next to it because, as I've mentioned in the new syllabus and in other videos, all of your work can be submitted on May 18th or any time up till May 18th. The difference is, or the thing is, if you submit it then, you'll get less feedback. If you submit it earlier at the due dates I specify, I'll give you more feedback. Again, feel free to contact me if you need any more flexibility. I'm happy to give it. So this is the first part of the reflection/synthesis project that I've described in the new syllabus. That is the third major assignment for the class. And this one consists of 5 parts. 4 one-page reflection papers, first of which is due on the 26th, and then finally a 3-page synthesis paper that combines and integrates ideas from across your reflections. I'll give you more information on that when we get closer to it. So for this first paper, I want to give you 2 options, and you're going to have 2 similar options going forward. I recognize that for this assignment, not everyone is going to want to focus on our current circumstances. Maybe you want to get your mind off of that. So for each of these reflections, and then for the synthesis, I'm going to give you the option of either focusing on the current circumstances, because I think they are very relevant to the topic of human development. We're developing as we adjust to these new conditions. But if you would rather focus on some other aspect of human development, you can do that too. So for this reflection and for future ones, you have 2 options. The first option is to identify and describe an example of a developmental change, a change in our thinking or cognition and behavior that involves assimilation and accommodation. So these are concepts that were originally in the Piaget reading that we went over several weeks ago. You may remember this slide from the Piaget slides. And so for the reflection paper, I'll come back to the slide in a second. What I want you to do is to identify or to think up an example of a change in someone's behavior that would involve both assimilation and accommodation, and describe the role of assimilation and accommodation in your example. Before moving on and describing that first option in more detail, I want to now describe the second option for those of you who want to take it. So the second option. The second option is to observe or to recall the developmental changes that you have observed in your own behavior or in others' behavior over the period of the last week. So are there things that you've done more frequently, or that you would not have done before, or would have been very less likely to do before, that you have now done? Consider not just the obvious things, but whether there's certain behaviors that are kind of familiar that you would not have normally done that are now happening more often. Or is there a change in, what sort of changes in your routine are there? And again, when I say not just the obvious changes, I mean, we've all spent days at home before, but how is the organization of our day different? Now, I want you to go a little bit further with this too, and not just talk about, comparing what you were doing before, let's say, February or in early March with what you're doing now, but look at what you have been doing over the last week, possibly 2 weeks, and see if you can identify any developmental changes within that time that are what we could call stages. So to explain this, I want to give you the interesting example of the fireweed plant. The fireweed plant grows on the west coast where there are forest fires. You can see it here, the pink flowers. It's a beautiful plant. You can actually get honey that is made from the honey of bees that have eaten the fireweed pollen. And what the fireweed is and why it's called fireweed refers to its role in the community of plants, an area where there are devastating wildfires. So out west, where you regularly in the summer have large wildfires, which come through and burn down large swaths of forest, what happens is, eventually, as all devastating things do, the fire comes to an end, things calm down, rain falls, life begins to reemerge. You don't normally see the fireweed plant until you get to these, it exists in smaller numbers. But after a forest fire has come through, and the forest, the trees have been burned up, there's ash everywhere, charred pieces of wood, the fireweed is particularly well adapted to these conditions, and it flourishes. It spreads, covering the formerly burned area of the forest. And this is beautiful, it creates this pink color. But what the fireweed is it's a stage in the process of succession of the forest. The fireweed is adapted to growing very well and to thriving in the conditions that occur after a forest fire, to growing up through the ash and the cinders. And so it multiplies. But then as a result of the fireweed multiplying, eventually it creates new conditions, which lead other plants that would not have initially thrived right after the forest fire, it leads them to thrive. Then those plants take over. They start to thrive. Then they create conditions that are eventually suitable for ultimately the original plants in the forest to come back. So decades later, after the forest fire, you will see a forest made up of the same composition of plants that were there before the forest fire. Those didn't come back all at once. There was a developmental process that brought that back. The reason I bring up the fireweed is I think that we can take it as an example or as a metaphor for our current circumstances. We're all experiencing a massive disruption right now. And when we're faced with any disruption, our behavior is by default changed. We're in totally new conditions. But the process of adjusting to these conditions is a developmental one. So what I want you to think about is whether in your behavior over the last week or so, is there something, or in your behavior over the coming week, is there something that's equivalent to the fireweed? A new form of behavior that establishes itself, that maybe it was there in small numbers, just like the fireweed is always there. You'll see occasional fireweed plants in any alpine meadow. But after the forest fire, they come to predominate. They're everywhere. Is there something like this in your or in someone else you can observe in their behavior over the recent days? Can you find an equivalent of fireweed? So that is option one. The second option is, that's option two. The second option is, if you'd rather not focus on this, is to find examples of assimilation and accommodation. in your own or someone else's behavior. You could even use an imagined example or a made up example if you wanted to for this. So I just want to go over this briefly in case you forgot. We covered this several weeks ago. So assimilation, accommodation are concepts from Jean Piaget's theory of development. So here, just to guide you towards the readings. So Piaget claimed that when we develop, there is a balance between two processes. A process of assimilation, right here, and then accommodation. You have to have both, 1 and 2. They have to be in balance. I'm realizing right now that I'm not going to be writing this way in the future. It's very tedious. So, as you may remember, assimilation and accommodation pertain to schemas, or the plural schemata. And schemas are the basic building blocks of knowledge that we develop. So we construct schemas to make sense of our experiences, as you remember. Then we have those schemas, those schemata, we can use them to make sense of new experiences. When we do this, we are assimilating the new realities we confront into our pre-existing schemata. So this happens anytime we confront a new situation and we understand it as a particular type of situation, or we see something or hear something or learn of something and we see it as a particular type of thing. So a child is taught the word dog, and while they're walking down the street, they see something and they assimilate it into their schema for dog. So what happens when they feel that they have seen a dog? So they may say, oh, look, it's a dog. So they've assimilated this thing walking towards them into the dog schema. But if this is a young child, and they've just begun to learn what a dog is, their schema for dog may not be fully adapted in a way that's sufficient to reality. So what they think is a dog may in fact be something else. So when they say, oh, look, it's a dog, the person they're with may be confused and act surprised and say, what dog? So when this happens, it creates a process known as disequilibrium. Disequilibrium is a conflict in our thinking that results from a lack of fit or a disjointedness between the schemas that we have and that we use to make sense of some event or object. In other words, the schemas that we use to assimilate some event or an object, and that event or object as it actually is. So it's a mismatch, in other words, a mismatch between our thinking and reality. A simpler definition. So in the example of a child who's been taught what a dog is, seeing an animal walking down the street and assuming it's a dog, assimilating it into their dog schema and saying, oh, look, Mom, it's a dog. But let's assume it's not a dog. Let's assume that someone is walking their cat down the street. The child assimilates the cat into their schema of dog. But when they point out to their parent, look, it's a dog, or when they say to the actually a cat as it walks by, they say, oh, look what a cute cat. And the owner or their parent is confused. They say, what are you talking about? Sorry, they say, oh, look what a nice dog. The owner or the parent is confused. They say, what dog? There's no dog here. This is not a dog. This creates disequilibrium. for the child. There's a mismatch between what they think there is and what actually is. So disequilibrium has to be resolved. Remember, according to Piaget, we resolve disequilibrium how? By constructing or adjusting our existing schemas to better fit reality as we have experienced it. So for any developmental change, according to Piaget, there is a balance between assimilation and accommodation. You need to have both. You need to first attempt to assimilate a situation or an object into your existing ways of thinking, to make sense of things in terms of how you think the world is. But then to have this come up short, to have it create disequilibrium that forces you to accommodate, to construct new ways of thinking that better match reality. So when there's a developmental change, according to Piaget, it involves both assimilation and accommodation in balance. If it's just assimilation, then your thinking isn't developing. You're just interpreting everything in terms of your existing ways of thinking, regardless of how well adapted, how nicely they fit that reality. If you're just accommodating, then you're not preserving any existing ways of thinking. So, for this week's reflection, if you choose this first option, you will be identifying a cognitive or behavioral change and identifying specifically the assimilation and accommodation aspects of this developmental change. They, as I say here, these should both be in the same example. Oops. Yeah, I'm still just getting used to this. So I say they should both be in the same example. It doesn't make sense to have one example of assimilation, like a child sees a dog and they interpret it with their dog schema, and then to have an example of accommodation that is from something totally different. They should be in the same example. So the child sees what they think is a dog, they assimilate it into their dog schema, in other words. But then there's some kind of disequilibrium. Describe what that is and describe the accommodation that the child must make. In the dog and cat example, it would be the child constructs a schema or adjusts their dog schema to account for the fact that not every four-legged animal that they see is a dog. There may be other types. They hear the word cat, they may construct the cat schema to account for this thing that is apparently, they've learned, not a dog. All right, so that's due on March 26th. So you either do the first option or the second option. As always, please let me know if you have any questions. You can email me. If you would rather call me, you can do that as well. My number is on the syllabus and on the introduction video, the first of the 3 videos I submitted today. But let me know if you have any questions. All right, so I'll be in touch soon.